Hello, welcome to my talk. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Millard. I'm a senior lecturer in computer science and autonomous systems in the School of Computer Science at the University of Lincoln. And my main focus of research is on swarm robotics, and it has been for about the past 10 years. Specifically, I focus mostly on fault tolerance, so trying to figure out when robots are developing faults, so detecting those faults as they occur. So if motors break or sensors fail, or robots just start acting weird, can we get robots to detect that that has happened? Can they then diagnose what kind of fault has occurred? So is it a motor failure or some kind of sensor failure? And then what can we do to recover from that? So do we leave a robot behind, or do we try to repair it in the field, or some other form of recovery action? And throughout my research career in swarm robotics, I've seen various different attempts at various different aspects of the field. So I thought it would be good in this talk to kind of give a brief overview of where the field came from, what the current state of the art is, and where things are heading in the future. And of course, it'll be a very kind of like light touch, broad view of the whole thing. There's not much time to go into too much detail, but I'm happy to take questions at the end if anyone has them. But throughout this talk, I'll try to give like a good overview of what's out there, and hopefully that will set people in the right direction if they want to find out more. So, yeah, roughly the overview of the talk then is I'll start out by defining what swarm robotics even is, and distinguish it from things like single robot systems or maybe other multi-robot systems that might exist but not at the same scale. I'll talk about the benefits of swarm robotics. So, why might you want to use a robot swarm instead of, one robot or 3 to 5 robots? And then I'll kind of rewind and we'll go back to, where it came from, which really is from like observations of natural systems like swarms of ants. And once we've covered that, I'll go through the current state of the art, show you what the kind of like lab-based research that we're doing and other institutes around the world are working on, and then I'll kind of speculate on what the future holds in terms of potential applications, and when this, when we start to see swarms of robots in our daily lives solving tasks, fixing problems for us. So this robot on the right is one that we've developed here at Lincoln, called the Coleus robot. It's very, very small, as you can see, not much bigger than a coin. And it's, what you might notice from what you might consider as a robot in your mind, you might think of like a humanoid robot. These robots are very, very simple. They tend to have a couple of wheels. They've got some basic sensors on them, like proximity sensors, so they can avoid walls. Sometimes they have cameras, sometimes they have microphones, things like that. But generally, they're much, much simpler than single robot systems. And that makes them much more cheap to produce, so you can have many, many more of them for the same price as a single robot system. But of course, we're not limited to robots of this size or this type. You can use flying drones or even like underwater robots as well. But this is quite a typical example, just because it's convenient for us to use in the lab. So yeah, what is swarm robotics? So there's been various definitions over the years, but mostly they agree on the idea that it's coordination of many relatively simple robots. So the robots are kind of relatively simple with respect to the task at hand. That means that they're not able to solve the task on their own, or if they were to try and solve it on their own, it would be very slow and inefficient. So they have to work together in collaboration, through usually like communication between individual robots and through their environment, so that much like natural swarms, they come together and do something intelligent as a collective. So it's, originally it was inspired by the behavior of social insects, but not just limited to social insects. We're talking about like herds of sheep and flocks of birds and schools of fish. Any kind of natural system that you'd see where there's lots of individual agents and they seem to do something as if they're one super organism that acts together as one unit. So like a swarm of bees, for instance. So it's come from that kind of like natural bio-inspired roots, but it's grown beyond that now, and it's become more of an engineering discipline in its own right. So it's kind of a subfield of robotics in general. And and the field is, is constantly evolving. People are redefining what it means for a swarm of robots to exist. It used to be the definition that all of the robots had to be the same. Like these ones on the right, they all have to have the same capabilities. We're starting to look now at robot swarms that have mixed capabilities, so robots that might have different hardware, or they might just be running different software and performing different behaviors, or even mixing like ground-based robots with aerial drones, which we'll see in a video later, or mixing that again with surface water vehicles or underwater vehicles as well. So even though there might be definitions out there, because the field is relatively young, the definitions keep changing, and I don't think there's any one definition that completely sets in stone what a swarm robotic system is. And I think there is scope for interpretation, and I'll explore that through some of the case studies that we look at. But so the really key principles that I think apply to pretty much all swarms, apart from one exception, which we'll talk about, is this idea that you use decentralized control and local sensing and communication. So centralized control basically means that you might have like a central server or a central leader robot that is commanding all of the other robots. And so you end up with this kind of network structure that you see on the left here, where all of the other nodes in the system all kind of like join in at one point. And that can be quite efficient. It's used in a lot of sort of like computer network architectures and things. It's good for like pooling information back together. And it's good for getting information out very quickly and designing systems that work quite efficiently in terms of like time, because you have like a global view of the system and you can tell every individual node what to do. The problem with centralized systems, though, is that you have these communication bottlenecks where all the communication has to go through this centralized node, and if the centralized node fails, then it's not very fault tolerant. So you've got a single point of failure there. If that breaks, then the whole system can fail. So Swarm Robotics tries to take principles from natural systems. I think that there's a bit of a common misconception about natural systems in that you might have like a queen bee, which means that there's some kind of like hive mind, or that the queen tells all of the other ants or bees in the colony what to do. I think that's generally accepted that that's not the case. Instead, it's more about this kind of like autonomous behavior of the individual agents in the system acting together, and through the interactions between each other, they do something intelligent. And hopefully through that we get some more robustness, because you don't get bottlenecks in the system and you don't get like single points of failure. And this all comes about through this idea of like local sensing and communication. So rather than individual robots being able to see the whole system at once, or being able to talk to all of the other robots at once, they have these, like circular radius of sensing and communication. It's usually not quite precisely circular like that, but it is range limited. So you might have an onboard infrared sensor that can only sense 10 centimeters, for instance, or you might have some communication hardware that lets you communicate wirelessly over a range of 1 meter. But the idea is usually that these communication and sensing systems are short range with respect to the size of the task, or with respect to the size of the swarm. So if you have a sufficiently large swarm, individual robots will not be able to talk to every other robot at once and have like a global view of the system. So they have to work relatively autonomously, work with their neighbors and their immediate surroundings, and act on local information that they have to hand. And the way that we design swarms is so that when they do that and they interact with each other in their environment, the collective behavior emerges at the swarm level, which is actually quite a tricky part of programming swarms. But yeah, so enough about theory. Here's a quick example of a typical swarm system. So we've got on the left, there is an object of interest in red that the robots are meant to be retrieving and bringing back to the blue base station. And if you think back, if the robots can only detect things within their local neighborhood and they can only communicate locally, then it means at the beginning of the experiment, they have no idea where the red object is. To begin with, they have to just randomly explore and try and find it. And then once they found it, they need to then explore, but without losing each other. So they have to form these physical chains where they remain within sight of each other. And you'll see that they're using different LED colors, which they can detect with onboard cameras to sense where they are. And once they're able to form a physical chain, so they don't get lost, when they reach the target, it's then too heavy for one of them to drag on their own. So they have to collaborate either through connecting to each other's bodies with an onboard gripper and pulling on each other's body in a chain, or multiple robots can connect to the object and pull it at the same time. So, you know, you might think it seems a little bit inefficient in comparison to maybe more intelligent, more sophisticated robot systems. You know, you could put a camera on one of these robots and have them just see the object from afar, and have it bring it back. Maybe, you know, put weightier motors on the robot so that it can pull it all on its own. But the idea here is that, you know, we can add or remove robots and, you know, gracefully like increase or decrease performance. We don't have to like reprogram the system every time that we want to change things. We could dynamically reallocate robots to different tasks. And so you know, a lot of these lab-based research environments that you'll see deliberately kind of limit the capabilities of the robot, so we can explore these interesting interactions where the robots can't do much individually, but, you know, can we explore that idea of if they work together, can they do something intelligent? And then that usually makes them more energy efficient, resource efficient, computationally efficient, which means that we can miniaturize them further and make them cheaper. But as we'll talk about later, people are kind of breaking those rules recently and making robots kind of like more powerful and larger and giving them more cognitive capabilities. So why swarm robotics? The one that I'm really keen on here is this idea of fault tolerance. And so this video on the right is quite a good example. So we have a swarm of robots that you'll see are occasionally flashing red as like a heartbeat signal to the other robots to tell them that they're functioning in a healthy way. And the other robots can sense that and detect when a robot stops flashing, and it can use that as a sign that something needs to happen. You know, they might have detected a fault and then they need to intervene by doing some kind of simulated repair in this case. You know, at the moment with these lab-based platforms, we're not in the position to have robots swap wheels out or, you know, replace bits of like mechanical gripper technology. So in this case, they're simulating it by gripping onto each other for a few seconds to, you know, pretend that they're doing that repair. But just by the fact that you've got multiple robots here allows you to do that kind of fault tolerance. If this was just like a single robot, like a Mars rover, for instance, and it's out on Mars, completely remote, and it falls in the ditch, you know, you don't have anything there to help recover it. You know, even if you had 2 robots or 3 robots, they might be able to do something to tow another one out of a hole. So by having multiple robots, you gain this redundancy just for free normally by having more than one robot. If one of them fails, then things can continue. But you can also have these explicit approaches to fault tolerance where you can have robots try to explicitly detect when another robot has developed a fault and then see if they can do something about it, so that we can leave these robots running long term without human supervision and they can look after themselves. But aside from fault tolerance, I've kind of mentioned this already, they're quite scalable, so we could add robots to this system. You know, there's only 10 robots here, we could add you know, 30 or 100, and hopefully we'd get you know, just increased performance if we've got like a larger task for them to solve. And similarly, if we don't need as many, we can just remove them until we have like the right number for the task. And as long as you design your swarm control code in the right way, it means that you wouldn't have to completely reprogram the behavior. It should just, you should be able to drop a robot in or pull one out and everything should just continue as normal and dynamically adapt. And that also leads into this idea of flexibility. So you've got multiple robots, there's some aspect of parallelism in the system. So it means that if you've got a task that requires some robots to be doing one subtask, another one doing another subtask, they can dynamically change the proportion of which robots are doing task 1 and which ones are doing task 2 as the circumstances change. So if they've got a lot of incoming load that they have to deal with, maybe they're like processing packages or something, or moving things from one side of a warehouse to another, and the robots can dynamically allocate tasks within each other to cope with changing demands. So that's just like a very brief introduction to swarm robotics. And I want to take a bit of a step back to explain where it's all come from. And really, it's from these observations of natural systems. So here we've got flocking birds, and you see like starling murmurations, which you may have seen out in the wild, but then going completely the other end of the spectrum to microscopic bacteria and cell-like behavior. And then the traditional ideas of like social insect colonies like termites and bees and wasps and ants, and then schools of fish as well. And these systems are, they're constructed of hundreds or thousands of individual agents that are acting autonomously. They're using their local sensed environment around them to behave slightly differently. So with like flocks of birds, they're looking to see like how close another bird is. They don't want to get too close to it while also remaining close enough that they don't get lost. And they usually try to align their direction so they fly in a coherent flock. Similarly with the fish, you can see that they kind of move almost as if they're one organism, but they're actually composed of many, many individual fish all acting individually. So these systems have, these nice properties of like scalability, flexibility, and robustness. And that's what we wanted to try and capture, about 30 years ago when the field started. And see if we can harness that and convert it into some useful engineering problem-solving ability. But also just to try and understand these systems, can we create artificial versions of them in a computer before we even get as far as robotics, and see if that can help us understand the biology. Because if we can recreate these behaviors in a computer, maybe that informs our understanding of how the biology works. It might be a coincidence that they happen to, they might not work the same way, but we can recreate the behavior. So it's a bit of a back and forth with biologists and ecologists to see if we can learn those rules. So this is really what's led to a field that kind of predates swarm robotics, which is called swarm intelligence. So it's this observation that social insects and other herd animals follow these simple rules based on their immediate situation. So for example, on the right here, we've got termites who individually might detect that they've got like a piece of mud in front of them, and they'll pick it up and then they'll wander around with it until they see another mound of mud, and then they'll deposit their mud that they've got there. And then over time, they collectively accumulate mud in these kind of like enormous, well-ventilated termite mounds. And the individual termites in this case don't have like a blueprint of the nest. Like none of them, there's not like a leader telling them, you should deposit mud here, and you should, we've done 50% of the mound and we need to like build a tunnel in this structure. It's all based on depositing pheromones and depositing mud and kind of communicating through the environment in that way. And what, we call this self-organization when we see it in these systems, these patterns that emerge from the local interactions of either the agents with each other directly or through the environment. So if they deposit mud or if they deposit pheromones, and then they can react to that. It's a similar situation in terms of like bees creating honeycomb structures out of wax. They're just following rules based on their immediate circumstances, and those rules are the results of millions of years of evolution. And it's just, it's not like someone programmed to do these things, which is what we're trying to do with swarm robotics. It's just that they've evolved these behaviors because it is whatever helped them to survive and be selected and evolve. And so what swarm intelligence is trying to do is trying to unpick those rules and figure out, what rules is a termite following to be able to construct a nest like this. And that might inform the biology, but also could we then use what we've learned then to solve some kind of like engineering problem. So this is really where swarm robotics came about. And this study is actually relatively recent, but this is kind of mimicking the termite-like behavior. So this is a system called stigmergy, which is the idea of communicating via the environment. So in this case, there's small blocks, which are similar to like the mud piles that the termites accumulate. And the robots here are just moving around relatively randomly until they see a block. And then when they see a block, they try to scoop it up, and then they'll deposit it again when they see another like high concentration of other blocks. So none of the robots here have any grand plan to create one single mound of blocks. And it's just through these kind of like almost random interactions of the robots with each other and with the environment that just, if you leave it running long enough, just due to sheer like statistical probability, eventually, because every robot will pick up these smaller bricks first and then put them down where there's a larger mound, it will all just eventually accumulate into one mound like this. So, through this sort of process of artificially modeling the behaviors that we think the natural systems are following, we can, try and understand how biology works, but also then figure out how we can adapt that to solve wider engineering problems. And of course, this has taken the robots a very long time. It's relatively inefficient, and that is often also the case in biology. But we could inject some extra rules here. Once we've decided that we're happy with understanding how termites work, we could now make the robots slightly more intelligent so that they can solve the problem in a way that maybe a termite might not be able to, because maybe its biology constrains its cognitive ability, whereas we can add more processing power to these robots or give them extra sensors that a termite might not have. So I think a lot of these swarm systems have come from this bio-inspiration, but since then we're kind of expanding beyond that, and we're trying not to be constrained by the biology anymore. So that's a brief history. I don't want to dwell on it too much, because a lot of it again is very much to do with like swarm intelligence, which is almost a field of its own. Whereas swarm robotics is more purely about, can we get that into like an embodied system where there's mechanical parts or servos and like real sensors in the world, having to cope with noise and extra things that aren't just like purely a simulation or mathematical model. So although the field has come from this bio-inspiration, the field is only about 30 years old, and I think though, if you count 30 years old, that's because we're counting papers that very briefly mention the idea of like swarm robotics, many years ago. But then there wasn't actually much research activity until about 2004 when things really started to pick up. And because it came about through swarm intelligence, everything used to be bio-inspired. All the robots used to be deliberately minimal. We used to deliberately like limit their sensors and limit their communication ability and limit their computational ability as well. But now people have started to kind of like change their mind and change the definitions of swarm robotics, because they want to do some kind of like engineering solution with them to solve a real world problem. We're trying to like loosen the rules. So there's quite a good categorization here where the original approach would be this nature-inspired minimalist swarm robotics. So you get your scalability because you're doing decentralized communication, decentralized control and local communication and local sensing. But you're also trying to be minimalist in the sense you want your robots to be simple in hardware and software. But then you also enforce nature-inspired constraints. So, for example, you might only allow the robots to communicate via some kind of artificial pheromone, whereas that might not be necessary if you have something like Wi-Fi, for instance, and they can just communicate wirelessly. So then the next level up from this, when we start to relax the rules, is we take away these nature-inspired constraints. So we maybe took some inspiration from biology, but we're not being constrained by it anymore. So you might take away that thing that says, the robots can only communicate via the environment. Now we allow them to communicate by themselves. But you probably still want to be minimalist, and that has a number of motivations. That could be because you're trying to save money. You're trying to make the robots individually very simple and very cheap to produce. It might be because you need the robots to be very small so that you can have lots of them in your environment. It might be because generally smaller and simpler things are less prone to failure. Like the more sensors and actuators you put on a robot, the more there is to go wrong. So there's quite a good few reasons why you might want to remain minimalist. And then this kind of like final tier is where we remove this minimalism rule and the nature-inspired constraints. And we just say, as long as the robots use decentralized control, and as long as they use local communication and local sensing, they could have a supercomputer for a brain for all we care. Conceptually, in reality, there's limitations such as battery life, and obviously we can't just put like a desktop PC on a swarm scale robot because it will run out of battery very, very quickly. But we're trying to explore these new areas where we don't limit our thinking to just the bio-inspiration that started the field, and that's allowing us to look at things like swarms that mix, flying drones with ground-based robots and that kind of thing. So here's an example of some quite bio-inspired work that we've done here at Lincoln. So this is just a small swarm of these 3 robots depositing virtual pheromones. So these are actually running on a television screen underneath, and then these markers that you can see on top of them work in conjunction with an overhead camera, and that has some kind of infrastructure then that can allow the television to know where the robot is, and then you can use a computer to draw a pheromone trail underneath them. And as they drive around, much like the way the natural pheromones work, you can have them evaporate over time. So you'll see that the trail, let me just go back over that again. you'll see that the trail evaporates over time, and that means that trails that are repeatedly trod over by robots will be reinforced, much like the way that ants learn to follow a trail that many other ants are treading over. And you'll see here that the robots are very actively attracted to the strong pheromone trail. But again, this is trying to take a cue from biology, and we don't necessarily have to follow these constraints. Like this is still very bio-inspired, and we could loosen these rules. So we could have the robots not strictly follow pheromone trails. We could have them follow them a short period of time, but then also branch out and do something else. So that's kind of nature inspired and like kind of nature constrained. The next level up is kind of like this practical minimalist approach. So this robot is the Kilobot platform that was developed by Harvard University. It's been around for quite a few years now. And you'll notice that it takes a different approach to these other robots that you've seen. It doesn't have wheels. It has 3 little legs, and it uses vibration motors like you have in your phone that buzz when you get a notification. And it uses those, it vibrates those at different frequencies to make the robot turn on its 3 legs. And they just shuffle along the floor, but they're incredibly cheap. I think the kind of like parts cost that Harvard quoted when they originally came out with these was something like $14 a robot. And their whole plan, because they're called kilobots, was the idea to create the first swarm of 1,000 robots, because previously people were working with maybe 10 or 30 or 50, maybe 100 robots, because the robots individually were too expensive. So this is an approach to try and make robots very small and minimal for the sake of having large-scale experiments with physical swarms that we could have only used in simulation before. So this is actually work that's been done very recently by the Bristol Robotics Lab. And so they're using kilobots here in the hundreds to basically see if they can form shapes. So that the shapes above that you see on the top of the screen are the shapes that the swarm is trying to create. And basically they project an image down onto the swarm, and they have color sensors, and they can detect where those boundaries are, and then they try to communicate amongst themselves and decide when to stop their movement to try and form these shapes. So this is, this isn't particularly bio-inspired. It's more of kind of like an engineering solution, but it's dealing with many, many, many robots. So we have to stick to these kind of practical, minimalist constraints, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to afford to build this many robots. And in terms of lab space, we're quite constrained as well. And so when these things move out of the lab, you have similar kind of like constraints on battery life and cost and size of the robot. So I think in many cases there will always be these practical minimalist considerations that have to be built in because we don't have infinite resources to build the robots. But this third class, which we'll move on to now, this sort of like scalable swarm robotics, where we don't really enforce many constraints. This is where we start to explore much higher level behaviors. So these are ground-based robots working with a flying drone, which has an aerial view and communicates with the robots on the ground. And they're using each other to help push each other over an obstacle that they wouldn't be able to drive over on their own due to the traction on the motors. And you can use robots like this for cooperative transport, for pushing objects, so the moving tanks of water and chairs. And yeah, so they could maybe eventually be used in the home for giving you beer and crisps while you watch TV. So the idea here is that you've still got multiple robots. You maybe don't have as many. You might have seen that you had maybe like 10 robots, but they're working with other types of robots, like flying robots, or maybe they're working with like a flying robot working with a surface vessel on the water. And they're probably using things like Wi-Fi communication, or if they're outdoors, using things like GPS and 5G to talk to each other, and probably using quite sophisticated sensors like cameras and doing image processing. So there's a lot more computation having to go on here, rather than just detecting their immediate neighbors with like infrared light and flashing an LED. So there really is a very wide spectrum of what is considered swarm robotics. And this definition is changing over time quite significantly. And so one thing that I think probably a lot of people might be aware of is drone displays. So these have become very popular recently, and I think especially because people are trying to break world records with these things. So this is, I think, the latest world record as of October last year. I think this is about 3,000 drones. And depending on who you asked, some people might not consider this swarm robotics. because there's certainly many robots here, but they do have like a kind of like global information about what they're intended to do. Like there is an element of centralized control here, in the sense that the robots are having to be told precise coordinates to fly to, so that they can form these very precise shapes. See here that they're creating 3D structures like the planet and orbiting satellites, and that would be very difficult for like a natural system to do if it's just acting purely based on information that has in its local environment. You could try and like encode that information. If you had like a 3D structure like a satellite you want to try and reproduce, you might be able to turn that into local rules that the individual robots follow. So if they see a robot in one position, they move to a similar position to try and form that 3D structure. But in general, these drone displays at the moment are being done using like quite an element of like centralized control. And so the robots are not really acting autonomously. They're essentially just kind of like remote lights for art displays. But that doesn't mean to say that, these things couldn't be done in a decentralized manner at some point. I think there have been a few cases of like drone display failures where there has been like a breakdown in communication or bottleneck, or like a central point of failure that has caused disturbances in these things. So I think you always have to think, if you see what might look like a swarm system on TV or in the news, then kind of bear in mind and think about what is it using, because a lot of these systems will be using some kind of like external infrastructure, whether it's localization cameras that tell the robots exactly what position they're in, or they're all talking to some kind of central server, and that's totally fine. And I think the definition of swarm robotics is changing, but if we want to keep those nice properties like decentralized control and like the local sensing and communication that give us the scalability and the flexibility and robustness, then it's worth keeping to those swarm principles, certainly when we move into like real world applications rather than just trying to do like artistic displays. So that's kind of like giving you a whistle stop tour of what the current state of the art is. But what does the future hold? So I would say at the moment there's obviously some work that is reaching outside of the lab. A lot of these things are still very much lab based. They're using like very small robots because we're limited on how much space we have in our lab environments. Again, they have to be very cheap and they have to be very like energy efficient, because if you're trying to do practical experimentation with these, you have to go and recharge all of the robots. But also there's some real challenges in terms of like how we program them, and how we kind of like move forward as a field to make sure that we make progress. But the key kinds of tasks that we're trying to target here are any kind of tasks that can't be solved by single robot systems, or maybe even by like a multi-robot system. So the traditional distinction is, single robots might just be like one Mars rover, or it might be one humanoid robot, or something like that. And then a multi-robot system is maybe where you have like 3 to 5 robots, maybe 10, but then they often have like a hierarchical leadership structure, or they have something in command, a central server telling them what to do. Whereas swarm robotics, again, is much more this kind of like decentralized self-organizing system. So the types of tasks those things are good for is anything that covers a very large area. Because if you put a sensor on a robot, a swarm essentially becomes a mobile sensor network. So there's a whole field of like wireless sensor networks that are used for things like environmental monitoring. Like you can just you could fly over a field and like drop them out the sky and just like have them land, and then just measure things like temperature and humidity and have them report back. You don't necessarily have to have some kind of like centralized infrastructure to do that. You can do like relay chain communication where they form ad hoc networks and funnel data throughout the network and back to a central point. So having robots that can just be put out into an environment and do some environmental monitoring without having to be explicitly told where to go. They can maybe follow some simple rules like following temperature gradients, or they could do some kind of like random walk, or they could move such that they try to maximize distance between their neighbors but still remain connected. And trying to span very large areas with one robot would take like an extremely long time, and even with like a small number of like a multi-robot system. So having swarms where you could scale up like the number depending on the size of your spatial area that you're trying to cover. That's really where they kind of come into their own. Another one is this idea of like oil spill containment. So this is like a really classic example given in the swarm robotics literature, and someone's done a kind of like artistic impression here of what it might look like. So if you have like an oil tanker and it begins to create an oil spill, maybe initially it's not too bad, and you could send out like a swarm of, you know, like 30 or 50 of these robots, and they, you know, you drop them out of a helicopter into the ocean, and then they can autonomously move towards as they sense oil and try to like physically contain the area. But then if something else goes wrong on the ship, if there's an explosion, or you know, if there's just like a further oil leak and the problem becomes larger over time, then if you've designed your swarm robotic system ideally, you would just be able to add more robots to the system. And you wouldn't need to reprogram them. You wouldn't need to tell them to do something different. You wouldn't have to have like a centralized command center that is micromanaging all of the individual robots. The hope is that you'd be able to put these robots into the environment and they would self-organize and reallocate work amongst themselves until they solve the task for the particular scale. And then, as you know, and as the sort of like disaster scenario starts to be cleaned up, then you could again remove robots from the system if you needed to reallocate them elsewhere, you know, for something else. And so then also, so tasks that require redundancy, so anything that's particularly dangerous. So, you know, there's quite a lot of work on nuclear decommissioning at the moment. So if you're sending robots into like old like nuclear silos or something where they need to decommission the nuclear waste, it's something where we don't want to put humans, but also that nuclear radiation could be damaging to robots as well. So if you can make a system of multiple robots that are relatively expendable, then they might be able to complete their task where a single robot might not be able to. So, you know, a single robot would go into one of these environments and it might fail due to like radiation affecting its like computer hardware. But if you have multiple robots, then even if you lose some of them, enough might survive to be able to complete the task. So that's another really good example of where like swarm robotics comes in. In those environments, it might not be worth trying to like repair robots because that could slow them down and cause problems. But being able to then detect when a fault has occurred, that could give them a hint about where there is some hazard that they might then avoid. And, you know, much like you see shoals of fish avoiding predators, you can have a swarm of robots that collectively avoid some hazard in the environment as others detect it. And then finally, so tasks that can't really be solved by a single robot. So if you think about like Amazon warehouse logistics, things like that, where they have multiple robots moving around, trying to move packages constantly, that's the kind of thing that you can't just solve with a single robot or even like a multi-robot system. And, you know, I think like warehouse logistics robots at the moment, things like Amazon warehouse robots, move on like a relatively constrained grid system, and they use a lot of like centralized control and highly optimized software to make sure they're doing the most efficient thing. Because like I said before, swarm robotics at the moment is very like bio-inspired and maybe not the most efficient solution in certain situations. But where you have maybe a less controlled environment, where you have less internal infrastructure, where you can't even have like a centralized server. Maybe you've got a GPS denied environment, or you're doing planetary exploration where you have to put the robots in a relatively hostile environment without any like infrastructure to help them. These are the kind of systems that you want to be able to deploy, and they just kind of self-manage. They form networks amongst themselves. They negotiate tasks amongst themselves. When they develop faults, they can reallocate work and help each other out. So in terms of like real concrete applications, then the one that people really always return to in terms of swarm robotics is this idea of search and rescue. So for instance, if you had an earthquake disaster site, you could have, you know, drones scanning the area looking for survivors, as well as like small robots that can like search among the rubble, and, you know, collaborating with human workers as well. You know, I think in a lot of these systems, we're not just talking about completely autonomous swarms of robots. We don't just want to like put them out into the environment. Most of these things would be designed to work with human operators in some way. So especially if you've got search and rescue tasks, they'd be working closely with emergency services staff like firemen, for instance, to try and like help out in those situations. Construction work is another big one. Like, people have started to look into research on, can we get robots to basically do something like termites, where we take building blocks like bricks or maybe prefabricated structures, and can we get them to autonomously piece those together to build complex buildings? I mean, it's obviously quite difficult if the robots don't have like a full view of the system, or they don't have like a blueprint. So this is where people are starting to relax like the constraints of swarm robotics. Maybe they're saying it's okay to have some centralized control mixed with decentralized control if it means that you can build a sensible structure rather than something purely organic like a termite mound. I think, yeah, I've mentioned mobile sensor networks already. Underwater exploration is another big one, because it's very difficult to communicate underwater. You can't use things like Wi-Fi. You don't have things like GPS. You're usually using like very like low bandwidth communication, like communicating through like flashing like lights to each other, like single bits of information that you're sending between robots. But that could be used for things like searching for like airplane black boxes after like a like an aircraft crash in the ocean, because that's often over like an enormous spatial area, and the way it's traditionally done is you send like a big ship, and then you send over like an autonomous like an unmanned vehicle that can search some small radius of the seabed, and then they don't find it and they have to move to the next place and try again. So again, this is it's a task that has to be solved over a large area, and that's where swarm robotics hopefully can come in and solve a lot of our problems. And then one that we're really interested in at Lincoln is the idea of precision agriculture, and can we have agri robots, and probably not swarm scale as you've seen in what I've shown before. We're not talking like hundreds of robots, but we're probably talking somewhere between like a multi-robot system and a swarm system, where maybe you've got like 10 robots or up to like 20 or 30, depending on the size of your farming operation. And they could vary in size. So you can have some aerial drones like the ones shown here. These ones are from a European project that are doing like weed identification. So they're like creating maps based on like overhead flights of fields. But you could have those working in collaboration with ground-based robots who are doing things like soil health monitoring or even harvesting. They could be looking for things like pest and disease and creating maps that are fed back to farmers. But yes, probably not quite as decentralized as we might have been talking about with traditional small robotics, mixing in elements of centralized control here just to try and make things a little bit more optimized and a little bit more efficient. But certainly taking some of the concept, especially from the fault tolerance side, so that you can leave these things unattended for a while without needing a constant babysitting by a human operator. And then finally, so medicine, like we've been talking a lot about like robots that are the kind of like size that you could hold in your hand. But this is some recent work by MIT on what's called particle robots. So they are incredibly simple, even simpler than the kilobots that I mentioned before. And all they can do is they can expand and contract. And they do that in response to light that they sense in their environment. And the idea is they have magnets on each other, so they can kind of like bind to each other and are attracted to each other. And then they can move collectively by kind of like synchronizing when they expand and contract. And that's much more akin to the kind of behavior that you could get from a biological cell. And people are already looking into the idea of, could you take these concepts that we develop in the lab with robots like this that are very, very simple? Could you take that and create like an artificial biological cell that you can program? Because I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we can miniaturize the mechanical aspects of a robot to shrink one down to the point you can put it in your body, or at least not in a useful sense for things like drug delivery. But certainly, if you could use these concepts to create like artificial chemical compounds that can do things like this. So here they're transporting an object amongst them, and that could be like a drug that you're delivering into the system. So swarm robotics really does cover a huge scale, from like these kind of outdoor robots that you might imagine in a field, all the way down to like the small lab-based robots that could then inform things like nanotechnology and medical applications as well. So finally, that's a dream in terms of what sort of applications we'd like to hit. The problem that we have at the moment in the field, the barriers that we have, 'to getting to that point is that swarm robotics is still a very young field. There's only 2 or 3 companies Like I said before, it's only about 30 years old, and really only probably about since 2004 that things have picked up. So unlike other engineering disciplines, there's not a strict methodology on how you go about designing a swarm system. The traditional approach is that you decide that you want a particular collective behavior, so like move an object from one side of the room to the other, and you do that by programming the behavior of the individual robots, the individual rules that they follow, and then you run the system and you hope that you figured out the rules so that when they interact with each other in the environment, they complete the task that you intended. So it's a very like error-prone, like trial and error process of constant like iteration. It's very laborious, and so people are starting to look into automatic design methods. So can you give a swarm of robots a specification of what you want them to do, and then have an algorithm, like some kind of machine learning, go away, figure out the individual rules the robots have to follow. So that's quite like a hot area of research right now, and it would make this a lot easier for us because a lot of the time we're reinventing the wheel or putting a lot of like programmer development effort into trying to just get the robots to do what we want. But also coming up with like common performance metrics and benchmark tests, this kind of like standardization that exists in other fields so that we can compare results amongst different systems. Standardization of software and hardware is like a really big thing. So you've seen through the various videos that I've shown in the talk that there are already, like a few different robot platforms, even within like ground-based and like flying drones as well. There's various different platforms there. And because swarm robots tend to be relatively simple, research labs have a habit of building their own because then they have full control over the system and writing their own software and writing their own simulators. So there is quite a lot of repeated effort in the field at the moment. I think in the field of like single robot and multi-robot systems, there's a little software sharing and hardware standardization, which is helping the field progress, whereas swarm robotics is kind of lagging behind in that sense. Everything's a bit more ad hoc, so I think we need to do a bit more joining up as a field so that we can standardize things and move forward as a group. And then, once we've designed these systems to do something useful, how do we make them useful to humans? Because like I said before, they're not that useful to just be put in the environment and left to their own devices. We probably want some human operator to interact with them in some way. And if you've got 100 robots, you don't want to have to micromanage each of those and check on them and make sure they're doing okay, and maybe have like a point and click interface where you click on each robot and manually move it around. So people are looking at these kind of slightly more wacky approaches where they're using things like augmented reality or virtual reality, where they can have like an interpreted virtual view of a teleoperated swarm where they can command them using their hands and gestures and things like this. So and there's a real challenge in, if you've got 100 robots with sensors on them, how do you collate that information back into a way that's intelligible for a human being? Because you probably don't want to read 100 different sensor readings off of all the individual robots. You probably want it aggregated in some way or averaged so that you can see what's going on. So that's a really key thing, and that's a really hot area of research at the moment. And then safety is another one. I've talked about the idea that a lot of these behaviors are emergent. So you program the individual robots and then you run the system and see what it does. And hopefully it does what you want. But in certain cases, you might end up with emergent behaviors that you didn't expect or that you don't want, or could be downright dangerous. Like it could just, the robots could end up destroying property or damaging themselves or, God knows what else. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment to try and verify exactly what the robots will do given certain rules. So that's using like formal verification and like mathematical proofs to try and figure out every possible situation that the swarm could be in combination with its environment, which is obviously, it's a lot of things to consider at once, and which is why it's especially difficult for swarms. But we're starting to develop those tools that allow us to give safety guarantees, so that you could say, if I put this swarm out in a field, it's not going to destroy a farmer's crops, for instance. And I think that also feeds into this idea of like public perception. And I think it's interesting that swarm robotics is starting to reach like public consciousness. I think people always talk about films like Big Hero 6, and they see swarms in like various different like bits of sci-fi and films. But then people are also seeing it through like drone displays. But whenever you have like a failure, like if you see a drone display and then there's been some failure because some element of the networking has failed, and then drones start falling out the sky. That's the kind of thing that damages the reputation of swarm robotics. So, there's quite a way to go before we get people to believe in swarm robotics as a useful, like trustworthy technology, and that it's safe, and that we could kind of like live alongside it, and it could like benefit us. Because it all does feel a little bit new and science fiction at the moment, but hopefully we're kind of like moving towards like a more mature engineering discipline as time goes on. So that's pretty much all from me. I just wanted to mention, so if you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, or robotics in general, or our other computer science topics, we've got some open days coming up. The ones in June through July are going to be virtual due to the ongoing pandemic situation, but after that, hopefully we're going to have some like in-person open days as well. But if you want to know anything more about that, probably the best place to find out is on our website. We've got a general inquiries email address and phone number, or you can get in touch with us on our social media or YouTube. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, yeah, thanks very much for the comments. Okay, so if nobody has any questions, then I'll leave it there. And if you do want to follow up with me, I'm not sure if I put my email on the slides. It's just amillard@lincoln.ac.uk. But if you Google my name, I'll come up on the Lincoln website. But otherwise, yes, thank you for attending, and stay in touch. Bye for now.